Good afternoon and welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. I hope the week's gone well. Let me start with a macro thought. Bull market also in policy uncertainty. This is from the market here. And I'm not sure whether you can trade that, but really that was a bit of a no-brainer in many respects, given the level of contestation we've been seeing. Of course, the Chinese pushed back quite hard yesterday, pre-US market opening, and they've learned from Trump and said they didn't think they can do a long-term trade with Trump. Trump, of course, then just before the market opens says we're on the cusp of a phase one deal. But it's a game of diminishing returns for Donald Trump now. He's got to work out a new strategy because it's no longer working, I don't feel. Home thoughts, this was particularly haunting. Ghost, pencil on paper by the artist Willie Husu from the Saatchi Gallery. Quite powerful. And then this one as well, The Man Without a Rod, Ukraine artist Sergei Shaulis. In this series, I was eager to show this very moment for what yesterday seemed to be a bottomless spiritual vacancy, today can be filled with new life goals. I like this as well, which has done the rounds. Argentinian artist Marta, Minujín's monumental replica of the Greek Parthenon, created with 1,000 copies of banned books. Art for our planet, very powerful. It symbolizes the resistance to political repression and the kind of dumbing down we've seen with this rat-a-tat of social media. Mark Bradford's Los Moscos from the Tate, the large-scale collage includes materials found by the artist on the streets around his studio in Los Angeles, visually suggestive of aerial maps of sprawling urban areas. The collage is constructed entirely from paper fragments which the artist believes act as memory of things pasted and things past. You can peel away the layers of papers and it's like reading the streets through the signs. The work takes its title from a derogatory slang term for migrant day laborers in the San Francisco Bay Area, reflecting the artist's long-standing interest in the subcultures of the inner city. And then I was listening to a podcast with Noam Chomsky, who I first discovered through his study of linguistics, which still gave me such a great interest in language and so forth. He was the catalyst for that interest. It is important to bear in mind that political campaigns are designed by the same people who sell toothpaste and cars. The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. This painting, which I've actually seen in the Tate, and it made a huge impression on me, Mark Gertler, Merry-Go-Round. The painting is undoubtedly Gertler's outstanding contribution to British modernism, as D.H. Lawrence recognized when writing to him in October. It is the best modern picture I have seen. I think it is great and true. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was painted just before, during the Hitler period, and it speaks to a very powerful sense of fascism in some way. And it really caught my attention when I saw it in the gallery. And it seems particularly apt for the time that we find ourselves in. When Lake Elmenteita is this rich in algae, the birds stay on even after dusk, so you can take the most stunning sunset photos. It is a wonderful lake. It's beautiful to sit and just look at it. I went there some years ago and I met Tom Delamere actually, and then Sunday we went for lunch together at his house. And really, Lake Elmenteita is very beautiful. And this is a photograph of sunset at the Mivumo Serena River Lodge, which I'd like to visit, but I haven't. The podcast, the Noam Chomsky podcast I was referring to, was with the Intercept's Mehdi Hassan, deconstructed special, well worth you listening to. He is really a paramount commentator who's given very little airtime, in point of fact. Hong Kong's GDP contracted a massive 3.2% in Q3, the most since the financial crisis, and more than 5 times as much as expected, as protests derailed the economy. That data point is from J.S. Blokland. And I wrote about this on the 21st of October, and I'll come back to that article in more detail, where I said prolonged standoffs eviscerate economies, reducing opportunities, and accelerate the negative feedback loop. And this is the problem that we're witnessing across the world, is that there comes a tipping point when it becomes a bit of a death spiral. The value of Hong Kong's retail sales in August fell by the most ever. That's just amazing. And I've written about Hong Kong. I was talking about Z building an algorithmic society. Unity is iron and steel. Unity is a source of strength. Complete reunification of the motherland is an inevitable trend. No one and no force can ever stop it, he said, when China was celebrating its 70th birthday. And in that article I was saying the folks in Hong Kong whom Xi is seeking to unmask so he can exercise algorithmic control over them are in open rebellion. And look at this, Halloween in Hong Kong amid anti-mask law doesn't get stranger than this. Kumamoto bear costume facing riot police with a Star Wars lightsaber. Photograph from Passion Times via Carmen Gakaman. Fantastic. Again, turning back to the 7th of October, Joshua Wong told German media, Hong Kong ist das neue Berlin. And I said then the Chinese dream has become a nightmare at the boundaries of the Han Empire. And I was referencing, of course, Xinjiang in particular, which is just so shocking. Pepe Escobar is always pithy, contemporary, on-point commentator, the age of anger exploding in serial geezers, consortium news. The presidential election in Argentina was no less than a game changer and a graphic lesson for the whole global South. It pitted, in a nutshell, the people versus neoliberalism. The people won with new President Alberto Fernandez and former President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner as his vice president. Neoliberalism was represented by Mauricio Macri, a marketing product, former millionaire playboy, president of football legends Boca Juniors, fanatic of New Age superstitions, and CEO obsessed with spending cuts, who was unanimously sold by mainstream media as the new paradigm of a postmodern, efficient politician. Well, the paradigm will soon be evacuated, leaving behind a wasteland, $250 billion in foreign debt, less than $50 billion in reserves, inflation at 55%, the US dollar at over 60 pesos. A family needs roughly $500 to spend in a month. 35.4% of Argentine homes can't make it. and incredible as it may seem in a self-sufficient nation, a food emergency. Macri, in fact, the president of the so-called anti-politics, no politics in Argentina, was a full IMF baby, enjoying total support and gifted with a humongous $58 billion loan. New lines of credit for the moment are suspended. Fernandez is going to have a really hard time trying to preserve sovereignty while negotiating with foreign creditors, or vultures as masses of Argentines define them. Apparently they're marching on the IMF's offices as we speak. There will be howls on Wall Street and in the City of London about fiery populism, market panicking, pariahs among international investors. The good news is that Argentina is now the ultimate progressive lab on how to rebuild a devastated nation away from the familiar predominant framework. And then there's the particularly explosive issue of how it will influence neighbouring Brazil, which as it stands is being devastated by a Captain Bolsonaro even more toxic than Macri. But the most appealing phenomenon was the emergence of a political superstar who I'd never heard of, but I have now, Axel Kicillof, born in 1971 and CFK's former economy minister. When I was in Buenos Aires 2 months ago, everyone wanted to talk about Kicillof. Fernandez won over Macri by roughly 8% nationally. In Buenos Aires province, though, the Macrists lost by 16% because of Kicillof. His campaign strategy was delightfully described as Clio Mata Big Data. Clio kills big data. He went literally all over the place, 180,000 kilometers in 2 years, visiting all 135 cities in the province in the humble 2008 Renault Clio. What Kicillof was selling was the absolute antithesis of Cambridge Analytica and Duran Baba, the Ecuadorian guru junkie of big data, social networks and focus groups, who actually invented Macri, the politician, in the first place. Fernandez, for his part, is aiming even higher, an ambitious new national social pact, congregating unions, social movements, businessmen, the church, popular associations, aimed at implementing something close to the Zero Hunger program launched by Lula in 2003. In his historic victory speech, Fernandez cried, "Lula libre, free Lula." The crowd went nuts. Compare it to Brazil, which has regressed to the status of semi-disguised military dictatorship, with the ominous possibility of a tropical Patriot Act being approved in Congress to essentially allow the nationalist military to criminalize any dissidents. Hit the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Then talking about Mark Morgan, a disciple of Thomas Piketty, who in a 2018 research paper showed that the Brazilian 1% controls no less than 28% of national wealth, compared to 20% in the United States and 11% in France. PEPE thinks that each of the outbursts, Catalonia, Lebanon, Iraq, the Gilets jaunes, Yellow Vests for nearly a year now, are due to very specific reasons. Lebanese and Iraqis are not specifically targeting neoliberalism, but they do target a crucial subplot, political corruption, he says. But it's in South America that protests go straight to the point. It's the economy, stupid. We are being strangled and we're not going to take it anymore. A great lesson can be had by paying attention to the Bolivian Vice President Alvaro Garcia Linera. To digress about populism is nonsensical. What's happening is the age of anger exploding in serial geezers that simply cannot be contained by the same old, tired, corrupt forms of political representation allowed by that fiction Western liberal democracy. So, let me take you back, because I sort of touched on this on the 21st of October in an article called The New Economy of Anger. And I was talking from Chile, where protesters burned down the headquarters of Enel, after proposed price increase all over Latin America, from Peru to Ecuador to Haiti to Honduras. Demonstrators have taken to the streets. I referenced how the IMF had cut the projected economic growth rate for Latin America from 1.4% to 0.6%. And I said people have been pushed to the edge and are taken to these streets, and that's the economy stupid. I was quoting Paul Virilio about the street. The revolutionary contingent attains its ideal form not in the place of production but in the street, where for a moment it stops being a cog in the technical machine and itself becomes a motor, machine of attack. In other words, a producer of speed. I said the phenomenon is not limited to Latin America, talking about the WhatsApp revolution in Lebanon, Hong Kong, open rebellion trying to shake off the crusher of bones Xi Jinping. And I said the phenomenon is spreading like wildfire in large part because of the tinder dry conditions underfoot. Prolonged standoffs eviscerate economies, reducing opportunities, and accelerate the negative feedback loop. Antonio Gramsci. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born, and in this interregnum a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Now is the time of monsters. And I said this level of unhappiness is unprecedented in a time of peace. Celestine Monger's The Great Discordance, the planet is filled with rage and anger. And I was complaining, saying leadership in the 21st century has become nationalistic and jingoistic. Horizons have been narrowed. Trump is not JFK, ich bin ein Berliner. Xi Jinping is all about Han China. Moody is all about the Hindutva. I was saying leadership is failing to appreciate the humanity of all our citizens in the world today. Kapuscinski, revolution must be distinguished from revolt, coup d'etat, palace takeover. A coup or a palace takeover may be planned, but a revolution never. Its outbreak, the hour of that outbreak, takes everyone, even those who've been striving for it, unawares. They stand amazed at the spontaneity that appears suddenly and destroys everything in its path. It demolishes so ruthlessly that in the end it may annihilate the ideals that called it into being. And I said this that we're seeing across the world is a revolution. It is a global phenomenon. And whilst I agree with the serial geezers, I think it is a global phenomenon. And the reasons are actually, the proximate causes might be different, but the underlying reasons are the same. Kapuscinski also said this: if the crowd disperses, goes home, does not reassemble, we say the revolution is over. And I said, it is not over, and more people are gathering in the streets. And unless we're now going to Xinjiang the whole world, 1 million people are jailed at China's gulags. And that I was quoting an article in Haaretz.com of a lady who managed to escape. Children are being taken from their parents, who are confined in concentration camps and being put in Chinese orphanages. Women in the camps are receiving inoculations that make them infertile. And I said, that current modus operandi is running on empty, and I think that's what PEPE is saying as well. I touched on Bolsonaro when I was writing about the end is nigh, the occasion of Unga and the climate crisis. And Bolsonaro said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And then he said in his speech, trails of death and destruction, ideologically infected human souls, and biologically perverted children. My recent article, of course, was from Russia with Love, which was talking about the Russia-Africa summit. And in that I touched on using Andrew Korybiko's delicious words, political technologists. And then we saw that New York Times article, a new message: Russia trains its propaganda machine on Africa. And they're sharing a library which includes Drift It like Putin's driver, Coups Are Us, American regime changes and their aftermaths. And in September 2012, I'd written about information warfare, which is what we're now living in. Will not be couched in the rationale of geopolitics, the author suggests, but will be spawned like any Hollywood drama out of raw emotions. Hatred, jealousy and greed, emotions rather than strategy, will set the terms of information warfare struggles. And indeed, that's what we're finding. And Russia's political technologists have reportedly devised bespoke solutions for this new information warfare century that we exist in. Let's go on to the currency markets now. The euro is at 111.57, dollar index 97.251, Japanese yen 107.95, Swiss franc 0.9859, the pound 129.65, and very firm these days. Australian dollar 0.6907, got on down a little bit yesterday with those comments coming out of China, but I think we're headed above 70. India rupee 70.89, South Korean won 1165.39, Brazilian real 401.74, Egyptian pound 16.137, and the rand 15.081. Dollar index, this is a chart from the market here, and I think it's a sell now. I've been bullish all year, but I've changed my mind. And that's something you should always be ready to do if you want to follow the markets. In point of fact, I tend to be a little bit slow changing my mind, but change my mind I have. Euro dollar, this chart is from last night from FX PEPE Titan, but I like this chart. I think you buy the euro, I think we're headed a lot higher. Sterling, I think it's basically priced everything in and is going above 130. This chart is from FX PEPE Titan as well. He's talking of 130.10 being a key objective. The renminbi back as a narrative. We saw an interesting reversal in the renminbi earlier today, meaning yesterday, on the back of news out of China. So far the move is not huge, but watch it just in case. And we're around the 704 level, which is quite a recovery when you think about it. Commodity markets, gold trying to get away from that 1500 level against his JS Blockland. We're now at 1514. My target is actually 1540, which is key resistance. And given that I've changed my mind on the dollar, I've got to change my mind on gold. Oil set for a weekly drop on rising Saudi output and trade woes. It was at 54.20 earlier today, and when I was writing this, and I put buy, and we're now at 54.30. I think it's oversold. A number of things happened yesterday which unsettled it. US production has hit another record, but nevertheless, I think it's cheap from my perspective in the overall scheme of things, and I think it's not factoring in the risk of supply disruptions. And given that we've got geysers going off all over the world, including Iraq, Lebanon, all that part of the Middle East, I think anything could happen at any time, and therefore I prefer to be long rather than short, particularly into the weekend. Better than expected earnings push India's Sensex towards a record high. Well, there you go. Can the centre hold? Ethnic violence threatens to tear Ethiopia apart. Every window of the factory on the outskirts of Adama is smashed on the side of the road of the scorched remains of a bus and lorries torched by angry young men last week. This scene of mob violence, just 75 kilometers from Addis Ababa, the capital, is one that is becoming wearily familiar to many Ethiopians. The democratic revolution, kick-started by Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister last year, has long been bittersweet. The government released tens of thousands of political prisoners, welcomed back exiled opponents, and promised free and fair elections in 2020. That's not going to happen, is it? Last month, Abiy won a Nobel Peace Prize for helping end a decades-long conflict with neighbouring Eritrea. But his efforts to put his own country on a more liberal path have been marred by rising violence and ethnic tensions. The latest killings suggest it is the transition's darker side that is ascendant. This is The Economist. 14th of October, and you know, after 90 days, I was so enthused with the man because he spoke a whole new language and his linguistics spoke to a future. I couldn't remember another African leader who'd sort of sketched out a horizon since Nelson Mandela, and I got carried away. But nevertheless, he does, as I wrote on the 14th of October on the occasion of his Nobel Peace Prize win, he faces a fiendishly complicated task, fending off the centripetal, and I still am confused. Centripetal, by that I think it's forces which are tearing something apart, right? I hope. Forces which are tearing Ethiopia apart. At least 78 people killed in Ethiopian protests last week, says the Prime Minister's office, and saying that number could climb. 409 people have been detained. Supporters of activist Jawar Mohammed took to the streets last week. He seems to be the opposition figure around whom the opposition is coalescing. Took to the streets last week to protest against his treatment after he said police had surrounded his home in Addis Ababa. He has so many followers on Facebook. He started live Facebooking from inside when he was surrounded, and before they knew it, the people who surrounded him were themselves surrounded, and tried to withdraw his government security detail. Crowds of young men from his Oromo ethnic group quickly turned their anger against Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, himself an Oromo, by the way, saying that he'd betrayed them by mistreating Jawar. Bilen said that at least 78 civilians had died in a very senseless act of violence in the Oromia and Harare regions and the eastern city of Dire Dawa. Zimbabwe government workers plan paid protesters' economy slumps. Zimbabwe is mind-boggling, really. They must be the most gentle people in the world. Goodness. Government workers in Zimbabwe on Thursday announced plans for a massive protest march next week to press for higher wages, as the finance minister said the economy would this year fall into recession for the first time since 2008. The Apex Council of Public Sector Unions said the government had not responded to its demands for US dollar index salaries to cushion workers against inflation that economists say reached 380% in September. But of course we can't verify anything. It's like Tanzania. They're not allowing us to. As a consequence of the above, the Apex Council is calling upon all civil servants to prepare for a massive protest march, the council said. In a letter to Labour Minister Sekai Nzenza, the union chair Cecilia Alexander and Deputy Thomas Muzondo said the demonstration would be held on Wednesday, when they would hand a petition to the government. Finance Minister Mthuli Cube earlier told lawmakers that the economy is set to shrink by 6.5% this year, its first contraction in a decade after a drought and power shortages. There's a tremendous heat wave heating up southern Africa. My mother-in-law is in Blantyre, Malawi, and she said that she's having to take rehydrate pills every day. And here, meanwhile, because of this Indian Ocean dipole effect, we got a ton of rain. It's really quite nice. Koob said water in the Kariba Dam, which can produce 1,050 megawatts, was so low that we're dangerously close to a level where we have to cut off power generation. Kariba was producing 122 megawatts only on Thursday. I take you back to Yuval Noah, money is the most universal and most efficient system of mutual trust ever devised. There's no trust in Zimbabwe in the government, and therefore the money is Mickey Mouse, and it's never going to change. Cowrie shells and dollars have value only in our common imagination. Their worth is not inherent in the chemical structure of the shells and paper, or their colour or their shape. In other words, money isn't a material reality, it is a psychological construct. It works by converting matter into mind. Here, no one is prepared to have matter converted into mind because they don't trust them. And Zimbabwe is a classic example. There's a correlation between high inflation and revolutionary conditions, although Zimbabwe is like, it's going to get there at some point. I said the mind game that ZANU-PF played on its citizens has evaporated now in a puff of smoke. But, as Kapuscinski said, the choice of that moment is the greatest riddle of history. And We haven't chosen the moment yet there. But, as I said in January, Zimbabwe is at a tipping point moment. The Moody's Investor Services Mystery, a South African rating that just won't sink. For a quarter century, South Africa has been able to count on an investment-grade rating from Moody's Investor Service. Bond buyers may be forgiven for wondering why. Financial markets have been pricing in a downgrade for months, and the other two major rating companies have had South Africa junk status for 2 years. Should Moody's follow suit, the nation would suffer enormous financial consequences. For one, the country would lose its place in the FTSE World Government Bond Index, which requires at least one investment-grade rating from either Moody's or S&P Global Ratings. Exiting it would spark an investor sell-off and outflows of as much as $15 billion, according to the Bank of New York Mellon Corporation. At a time when South Africa needs portfolio investment to finance its persistent current account deficit, a downgrade would also raise borrowing costs, complicating the government's efforts to balance the budget. South Africa doesn't need more fiscal woes. It's already spending $9.2 billion to bail out Eskom, the troubled state power utility. Debt to GDP is going to top 70%. Country's 10-year yield is almost 3 percentage points higher than lower-rated Brazil. From a ratings agency perspective, this means only one thing: the debt trajectory is unsustainable over the long term. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni himself said on Thursday that the fate of the Moody's rating was not looking good. They're scheduled to review its rating today. After a call with Treasury officials, the company declined to comment on why it hadn't downgraded South Africa. Moody's also rates Eskom's long-term debt at B2, 5 notches below investment grade and lower than Fitch. That means the utility has to rely on government guarantees to borrow in the capital markets, increasing the strain on state finances. So, political factors seems to have weighed a bit more with Moody's than with S&P. Moody's seemed to look more at the political economy, whereas S&P was stronger on technical factors. Market pricing indicates it's only a matter of time before Moody's comes into line with its competitors. The cost of insuring South Africa's debt for 5 years using credit default swaps is more than double that for Russia, which has a similar rating to Moody's, and it's higher than that of Brazil, which is rated junk. Premium investors demand to hold South Africa's dollar debt rather than similar maturity US Treasuries at 345 basis points is about on par with Bolivia, Jamaica and Belarus, both 6 notches into junk. And among emerging markets, only junk-rated Turkey, Lebanon and Nigeria may pay more for 10-year local currency debt. It comes down to, will Moody's see fiscal effort? Are they seeing an effort to actually do something on growth? And then they're going to have to weigh that up with a more fundamental deterioration in GDP and debt and the fiscal metrics. Charlie Robertson, who's the chief economist at Renaissance Capital and a friend, has pronounced that South Africa is heading for a junk downgrade. A meme flying around on social media is that there is a new sex position called the Ramaphosa. Get on top and do nothing. Well, now he's trying to do something, but it's no easy task. 13th of August, I wrote about the feedback loop phenomenon as the purest proxy for the China, Asia, emerging markets and frontier markets feedback loop phenomenon is the South African rand, and that's why it's also struggling, because of that negative feedback loop. It is the most volatile currency in the world, and I said in August that it's at risk of a further asymmetric downside move. But as I've said previously, 1450 to 1550, we've been in there for quite a while. Have a look at this chart from TradingView. We're at 1508. So we break 1550 and we're off to 17 in my view. South African all shares up 6.99% year to date. Egyptian pound is at 16.1538. Egypt, of course, CC, for all its faults, has done a much better job on the economy. EGX 30 is up 11.68% year to date. Nigeria is considering selling Naira-denominated Jollof bonds abroad next year to fund infrastructure projects. The Nigerian all-share, one of, I think, the worst performing stock market in the world under Buhari, down 16.13%. Ghana Stock Exchange down 13.95% year to date. Sudan once had the largest railway network in Africa, with most of the train cars obtained from the United States. But decades of negligence, economic troubles and US sanctions have made the railway reliant on Chinese-made trains in parts that it can hardly afford. Yassin remembers the railway's glory days when it was the largest in Africa, running 5,000 kilometers from the Egyptian Red Sea, crisscrossing Sudan to what is now South Sudan. So they're hoping for lifting of sanctions, and then they can rehabilitate their railway network. 29th of July, I wrote about the oud spring in Khartoum, and if you smelled oud like I did once, I was given a beautiful gift by the Saudi ambassador, then went to Kazakhstan, and I kept on smelling myself. It was like very strange behavior on my part, I must admit, but it was that good. The zeitgeist of the revolution in Khartoum was intoxicating, and as I watched events unfold, it felt like Sudan was a portal into a whole new normal, and I hope they make that move through that portal. Hugh Masekela said, "I want to be there when the people start to turn it around," and Sudan is a Masekela pivot moment. Coming to Kenya, Kenya has experienced steady growth over the last 4 years, said C. Felipe Jaramil, who is the head of the World Bank here. But the issue is now getting a lot of ventilation, which is all about this story, "You cannot eat GDP," which I'd written about in August 2017, and prior to that, Patrick Jorogi speaking about it as well. GDP growth slowed to 5.8% in 2019. Over the last 5 years, the services sector has grown at an average of about 6% and has accounted for almost 2/3 of Kenya's economic growth. You've got to give Kenya credit, it's much more of a diversified economy than many other African economies. Agriculture, however, remains a key contributor to growth, accounting for at least 26% of Kenya's GDP. Safaricom reported first half earnings. EPS was up 14.4%. Voice revenue declined 1.4% to 46.87 billion. M-Pesa revenue, look at this, 41.97 billion, up 18.2%. Very much the jewel in the crown. SMS revenue down 11%. That's all about betting and greater controls. Mobile data revenue was up only 4%, but huge surge in consumption, exactly the right thing that they're doing there, boosting consumption, lowering prices, and eventually then they can play around with that, and you will see a big surge in earnings. For now, they're going, it's a dash for growth. Fixed service revenue was up 18.4%. EPS up 14.4%. Overall, I don't think you can complain about this. Data is the focus for the future. It's grown by 14.8% to 20.2 million customers and 919 MBs usage per customer. Satish calculated that over the last 4 to 5 years, Safaricom invested more in Kenya than the competition has across the entire African continent. That's just incredible. I thought they were very impressive half-year performance, and M-Pesa was the standout for me. And remains the jewel in the crown. Continue to drive mobile data usage, which is precisely the correct response. Plus 14.4 EPS in a soft economy is actually stellar in my view. Kenya shilling is firm at 103.25. Nairobi all shares now up 13.62% year to date. That's all been about the banking surge we've seen since the president pronounced that he wanted the rate caps removed. That will happen if it's going to happen next week in Parliament. Nairobi NSE 20 has reduced its year-to-date loss to 6.72%. Thank you for stopping by.